Hello, bonjour. Welcome from the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Bienvenue de la part du Musée canadien pour le droit de la personne à Winnipeg, au Manitoba. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation about ageism and human rights. I'm Angeliki Boyazzi, and I'm Interpretive Program Developer with the Indigenous Relations and Community Engagement team at the museum. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights is located on Indigenous ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory. The Red River Valley is also the birthplace of the Métis. We acknowledge that the water in the museum comes from Shoal Lake and are grateful to the First Nations that care for the water. We are committed to reconciliation, which begins with our acknowledgement that Canada committed genocide against Indigenous peoples. The Indian residential school system is a key component of this genocide, but we also acknowledge acts of genocide against thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA, and we will continue to bring these stories to light in our work at the museum. It is a privilege to connect with you today for our virtual panel discussion, Too Old, Too Young, a conversation on ageism and human rights. I'm so pleased to welcome Zena Simces and Simces Rabkin, our partners in this work, and invite them to say a few words shortly. Zena Simces' keen interest in human rights has extended over many years. She has been involved in organizing an annual lecture on human rights with the Atlantic Human Rights Center in Fredericton, New Brunswick, for more than 3 decades. She has also dedicated many years to addressing issues of hatred and prejudice as a leader with the Canadian Jewish Congress in British Columbia and with the National Committee. Dr. Simces Rabkin devoted some of his early career as a physician to providing health care in underserviced areas in northern Canada and Kenya, experiences that foster a lifelong commitment to equity and diversity. He has worked to advance the cause of human rights in various committees in both the private and public sectors.
Welcome. Before we begin, Simon and I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations of the Coast Salish peoples. We would like to welcome you to the 6th annual Simces and Rabkin Family Dialogue on Human Rights in partnership with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and Equitas. Our special gratitude goes to the Canadian Museum for being such a devoted partner, and our heartful thanks to Angeliki Boyazzi, Lindsay Affleck, and all the members of the team at the museum that work with them. This is our 3rd year partnering with Equitas, which is an international center for human rights education, and a thank you goes to Angie Ozachaw for your support of this event and for the amazing work you are doing to educate young people on human rights. We established this dialogue to enhance understanding and create an opportunity for conversation on current human rights issues that are impacting all of us as individuals, as a community, and as a society, with the hope of generating positive actions. We have moved to a virtual format to be able to reach out to a wider audience across Canada and beyond. Today's topic is on ageism and human rights. My work in the health and social service areas over the years have addressed many issues relating to older adults and youth. As a member of the National Seniors Council of Canada over the past 3 years, the issue of ageism has been a critical focus of attention. To better understand ageism, I believe it is important to first understand what is aging. It is not just about older people. It is the usual human experience we all go through every moment of our lives. We need to think about it, not as a process of decline, but rather as a process of living, of growth and change. It is within this context we can better understand ageism, and you will hear more about this from our panelists. But ageism is any time we make an assumption, a judgment, a stereotype, or discriminate based on age. And this can go in any direction. You've often heard people say, too young to understand, too old to understand. It can be directed toward oneself. It manifests in our interrelationships with others, and it is evident in our institutions and organizations. In fact, it is everywhere, and it matters. Why does it matter?
Why does it matter? Ageism impacts many aspects of life, and let me have a look and outline a few examples. It affects our health, both physical and mental. Studies have shown that psychosocial impacts of ageism include low self-esteem, self-exclusion, lack of self-confidence, and loss of autonomy, both for older and younger people. The data indicate that workplace ageism is associated with increased depression and long-term illness. Importantly, studies have found that older persons with more negative self-perception of aging have significantly reduced longevity. As a healthcare provider, I have sometimes seen ageism influencing the attitudes of healthcare providers on the type and amount of care offered to a patient. Age is an important factor, but should not be the only factor influencing medical decision-making. Ageism impacts our work environment, hiring, training, promotion, and retirement. We are judging somebody's competence to do a job based only on age. Younger adults may be thought of as not having sufficient experience or are not sufficiently committed. Assumptions about older persons include that they have significant cognitive decline or are struggling to adapt to new technology. These sweeping stereotypes ignore the diversity and contribution of both older and younger adults. Our society has many challenges. We should welcome the new thinking of our younger citizens and incorporate the opinions based on experience and wisdom of our older citizens. We will hear more from our panelists why ageism matters, how it impacts the human rights of older and younger adults, and how to counter ageism. It's my privilege to introduce our moderator, Andrea Reimer. Andrea is a longtime community organizer on issues of social, economic, and environmental justice. She was elected to the Vancouver School Board in 2002 and in 2008 successfully ran for Vancouver City Council and was on to serve 3 terms. In 2018, Andrea was awarded a Loeb Fellowship at Harvard for her civic leadership. After returning to Vancouver, she served as the first ever policy practitioner fellow at UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and was subsequently appointed an adjunct professor. She also teaches public engagement at Simon Fraser University. She herself has survived as a street youth and is now a strong advocate for social policy change. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. As you heard, my name's Andrea Reimer, and it is such a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon as the moderator for this year's Simces and Rabkin Family Dialogue on Human Rights, which, as you heard, is once again in partnership with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and Equitas. I would normally be joining you also from the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, as Vancouver is my home, but today I'm joining you from Ottawa, which is built on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. The peoples of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land and the people on it. As a visitor to the land, I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. As you heard from Zena, the goal of these dialogues is to examine current human rights issues that are impacting us as a community and as a society, with the goal of generating positive actions. So for our program this afternoon, this year's focus is ageism, and to help us learn about the impacts it has in our lives and society, we're going to be joined by 2 guests. Margaret Gillis, who has extensive experience working to establish ageism as a human rights issue, and Dr. Melanie Doucette, who brings both lived experience and academic expertise in how to improve the lives of youth in care. Margaret and Melanie will both provide opening remarks to ground us in the human rights aspects of ageism, after which we will have a conversation with the 3 of us to talk about the impacts, and then we're going to open it up to you for questions. As Angeliki signaled in her opening remarks, you can use the Q&A section to send your questions for our speakers. You don't have to wait till the final section to do that. It's going to be open during the presentation, but I'll remind you about it again when we get to that section in about 45 minutes. And then finally, with an eye to generating those positive actions that Zena spoke to, the final portion of today's program will be a call to action to all of you. Okay, let's get to it. Starting us off today is Margaret Gillis. Margaret has a very impressive resume in the field of establishing ageism as a human rights issue and in providing people with the tools to enforce those rights. Our support crew at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights today are going to put her full bio in the chat so that she can just dive in on her remarks, which will help us all contextualize ageism in a human rights framework. Over to you, Margaret.
Well, thank you to the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, the Simces and Rabkin families for this opportunity to discuss ageism and its impact on human rights. I'd like to begin by providing a definition of ageism from the World Health Organization's Global Report on Ageism. Ageism is the stereotype, how we think, prejudice, how we feel, and discrimination, how we act towards other based on age, any age. In today's discussion, I will be focusing on the impact of ageism on older persons, which is the work I do at International Longevity Centre Canada. As well, we'll be examining its impact on youth, which Dr. Melanie Doucette will be describing. Since we are at a discussion at the Canadian Human Rights Museum, I want to ask you if any of the following sound like human rights violations to you. Canada's long-term care homes having the worst record for COVID-19 deaths in developing countries in the first two waves of the pandemic. This despite 30 years of reports that the system was under-resourced, under strain, and needed reform. Older people denied access to hospitals and facing ageist attitudes and policies. A death rate of 80% of older persons from climate change events, like we saw in British Columbia during the heat dome in 2021, when 756 mostly older, poor, and isolated persons died in a completely preventable event. How about a law which dictates where older people can live and which allows governments to move older persons in long-term care as much as 150 kilometers away from family and friends against their will, as recent legislation has done in Ontario? An estimate that 1 in 10 older Canadians experience some form of elder abuse, keeping in mind that elder abuse is underreported and the rates are likely much higher. Ageist employment practices, negative media representations, and on and on. So of course the answer is yes. These are all clear and unequivocal human rights violations. Indeed, they are the very basis of human rights: the right to life, the right to health, the right to live free of violence and abuse, and the right to live independently. Most notably, these human rights violations are based on age and steeped in ageism. Now, ageism is pervasive. It can affect people at different ages and has serious and far-reaching consequences for person's health, well-being, and human rights. Ageism is an ism like no other because it's linked to a universal condition. And while the evil nature of all prejudice is ignorance and hostility, ageism has the extra bonus of creating self-hate in the old, while for the young, it's a prejudice against your future self or yourself. Outcomes for society as a whole are not much better. Ageism is toxic to the global economy and to health. For instance, a U.S. study showed a massive $63 billion per year impact on the economy as a result of ageism in healthcare. Perhaps one of the most distressing aspects of ageism is its prevalence, with the World Health Organization finding 1 in every 2 persons is ageist. Ageism is pervasive, harmful, very expensive, and yet it remains largely ignored. The human rights violations I have described are happening here in Canada, and we have seen little to change the situation. Now, I should note that there are protections against ageism in the Canadian Human Rights Code and the provincial human rights codes. The problem is, this takes time, money, and know-how, and our legislation and court processes are not well equipped to remedy complex situations like ageism, easily and cost effectively. We older people are starting to be a quarter of the population. Sorry, here. Just a moment. And we need to come together, and we need to have a bigger voice at working together. With that in mind, ILC Canada has led to the creation of the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism. So what is the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism? Now, it is the coming together of major aging organizations and individual citizens to confront ageism and bring about social change in Canada, based on the WHO World Report on Ageism. As I described above, the treatment of older persons is a stark wake-up call to society that we face an urgent ethical, moral, and legal imperative to establish effective ways to address ageism and enhance and protect the human rights of older persons. The Canadian Coalition has as its aim to raise awareness of ageism and work for the adoption of laws and policies and practices that support the human rights and social inclusion of older persons, ensuring our fast-growing demographic receives due profile and consideration. I'm going to ask you to join the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism as an individual or organization. We have the registration in the link. Now, I'd like to tell you about another way that we can fight ageism, which is with the adoption of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. International Longevity Centre Canada has worked to engage Canadian NGOs towards achieving a United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. My interest came out of my career in the public service of Canada, where I was once responsible for the Canadian response to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. I saw what conventions can do, and I'm convinced that we need one for older persons, particularly since the pandemic. Now, a United Nations Convention is a legally binding document signed by member states of the United Nations, which sets out in detail the rights each country must bestow on its citizens. Think of it as a separate set of laws that protect older persons' rights internationally. We know a number of other groups have the protection of the United Nations Convention, such as women, children, and persons with disabilities. Yet we do not have a convention on the rights of older persons, like there are for other groups who have been marginalized. And the evidence shows us that we need it, and we need it now. I just want to take a quick moment to tell you how a convention would support the rights of older persons. In general, a convention is the method to achieve positive change by combating ageism, guiding policymaking, and improving accountability of governments at all levels, which we most certainly need. A convention would also educate and empower and see older people as right holders with binding protections under international law. We need to work together to get the Canadian government to support a United Nations Convention, because so far they've been sitting on the fence. It behooves me to understand why our government is not supporting it. Indeed, they should be leading the way, as they have done so many times in the past when we have done conventions at the United Nations. So what can we do now? Well, let's continue to work together to ensure our country considers the rights of its older citizens. Regarding ageism, let's get more Canadian organizations and individual Canadians to join the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism. Tell the government we want a convention that codifies the human rights of older persons in international law, like those that exist for women, children, and persons with disabilities. Explain the need to have a human rights-based approach to address the care system, access to health care, support in emergency situations, and for those abused and neglected. We owe it to those who died unnecessarily in long-term care homes, in the heat dome in BC, and those who are abused and neglected to continue to fight prejudice in healthcare and in the systems and institutions in our country. Human rights begin at birth, and they end at death. In between, we're all the same, with the same human rights throughout our lives, and we need to work together now to demand that it be so. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. That was great context setting. And I love that you've got us into the call to action already. It's a good place for us to be empowered as we're learning more about it. So as you spoke to, and as Zena spoke to off the top, ageism is something that many of us think about in the context of older adults. So to help us understand some of the stark impacts ageism has on youth, we have Dr. Melanie Doucette joining us. Dr. Doucette has been working to improve the lives of youth in care for over 15 years, both as a former youth in care and as an academic. Her doctoral research, Relationships Matter for Youth Aging Out of Care, gave youth from care an opportunity to develop child welfare research, policy, and practice recommendations based on their lived experience expertise. And she has gone on to mobilize other research in a number of areas, which you can read about in her bio, which Angelique put in the chat. And maybe, Angelique, if you could put it in again, because it might be a little further back now. Melanie's going to show a short video before she starts her remarks. So I'll turn it over to Melanie.
Think about your turning of age birthday. Were you ready to be a fully self-sufficient adult? Think back to when you first moved out of your parents' home. Were you able to return if you needed a place to stay or a place to spend the holidays? Were you able to count on them and maintain a relationship after you moved out?
When I was younger and while I was in ministry care, I was separated from my sisters, so I basically aged out on my own in separate towns of my family.
For youth in long-term care, this is their reality. If they are unable to find forever homes during their time in care, they must rapidly transition to adulthood at the young age of 18 or 19, with no option to return in times of crisis.
Because of that, I ended up homeless. I was lucky enough to find places, find roommates, but it didn't really turn out the way that it should have when I turned 19.
This is due to provincial legislation across Canada mandating child welfare agencies to release youth from their care at the age of majority. This contrasts with the experience of their peers, who tend to stay at home up until the age of 29 and continue to rely on their families, friends, and communities throughout their adult lives. Due to this cutoff of supports, youth exiting care tend to have limited support networks, and most of the connections made during their time in care are formal, paid for, and have an expiry date. This is despite research indicating that supportive long-term relationships can act as a bridge during this difficult transition. Research also illustrates that the status quo is not working. Most young people exiting care are at high risk of experiencing multiple difficulties. Child welfare decision-making often does not include youth in care's perspectives, and their voices are often left out.
Children and youth in care are rarely asked for their input when the decision to remove them from their homes and their family of origin is made. We have no options to choose for ourselves and have no control over the direction our life is taking. These practices need to change, and children and youth from care need to be involved in all decision-making discussions.
This collaborative For a Voice research project aimed to take a closer look through the power of images and accompanying captions at the relationships that matter to youth from care and how those relationships can be developed, nurtured, and sustained over time in a healthy way.
I hope that people really, after this exhibit, realize that foster youth are also living, breathing people that have personalities.
Preliminary results showcase the need for broadening the definition of family to include pets and parent-like mentors, and broadening the definition of community to include online forms of connection. Connections to spirituality, culture, and the land were also identified as important, especially for racialized and Indigenous youth.
For our dear young ones that are in foster care right now, we ask a blessing for them. We want to carry a good vision that we're all part of a family, and we realize it and we recognize it and we feel the love and the kindness and the warmth of a family, all of us.
As a former youth in care myself, this project is close to my heart. Through our collaborative research, my co-researchers and I aim to showcase that youth in and from care have a basic need for connection to others, just like their peers do.
Forming relationships with youth in and from care so that our relationships with the system are not devoid of warmth and understanding.
We should also be given the opportunity, as part of our healing journey, to make connections with those people who will have positivity in our lives and help us build social capital.
As human beings, we cannot and should not have to exist self-sufficiently and independently from others. Our peers who are not in care are not expected to age out of their families at the age of majority and continue to rely on others throughout their adulthood. This is simply a normal part of life for them. However, youth in and from care are taught to become self-sufficient as they prepare to age out of the system, which imposes a lot of stress on them as they deal with yet another drastic transition in their lives.
After we transition, we should be able to keep, these long-term relationships that we have built in the system, regardless of who they were with. Like, your counselor or people that you met, in your group homes, or, not have restrictions on, housing or based around even your pets.
To keep our inner fire alive, we need to be interconnected to others who can help us thrive within our communities. We need to be provided with the same level of ongoing care, support, and love that our peers receive, so we can get a fighting chance to thrive and not just survive.
I am joining you today from the unceded and stolen traditional lands of the Mohawk Nation, otherwise known as Montreal. And I wanted to show you this video of my doctoral research, which I did in Vancouver in 2017, 2018, to provide context on the aging out of care issue, because I know a lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with it or aren't even aware that it exists. And as you can see, the transition of adulthood for youth in care is deeply inequitable when you compare it to the experience of young people in the general population. And this is something that I personally experienced. I was in care in the 90s and I aged out at age of majority. And this is something that the people that I work with in research and also in projects also experience today. So in the video, it showed that youth in care have to exit at the age of majority, but youth in the population stay at home sometimes up to the age of 29. And with Statistics Canada census data from 2016, it showed that nearly 63% of youth between the ages of 20 and 24 were still living with their parents, with many continuing to live at home, almost 50%. Up until the age of 30. And I'm sure those statistics have even increased since the pandemic. Youth in care don't have that luxury. They're legislated to leave the system at age of majority. So they're deemed too old to remain in the child welfare system after they reach 18 or 19, depending on where they live in Canada, but yet too young to be sitting at the table when policy decisions are being made that impact them, and sometimes even at their own intervention planning meetings with social workers. Due to shifting socioeconomic realities over the last 20 years in most Western countries, there's a new developmental life course phase that has emerged in the academic literature called emerging adulthood. And this occurs between the ages of 19 and 29. It's a phase that encompasses young people who are not necessarily children anymore, but they're not quite adults. And it provides room for identity exploration, trial and error, obtaining post-secondary education, and just figuring out one's own place in the world. Youth in care aren't able to experience this crucial developmental phase because of the legislated age cutoffs. However, there's cost-benefit analysis in Canada that show that extending care into the 20s can reap significant positive outcomes for youth and society, with significant savings for social services systems. Return of $1.36 for every dollar spent on extending care up to age 25. The cost of not acting on that is actually quite high. The lives of youth in care. They lose their lives up to 5 times the rate of their peers in the general population. Another thing I want to mention before we go into the questions, Canada, unlike most Western countries, doesn't have a national or federal legal framework or accountability mechanism to really establish standards or guidelines to guarantee entitlements for youth in care as they transition to adulthood. So out of the 36 countries in the global north, Canada is one of the 6 that does not have federal legislation to protect the rights of youth in care. While Canada has ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it only provides human rights protections for children and youth until the age of 18. So youth in care who are transitioning to adulthood actually don't fit within the UNCRC because they're deemed too old, even though they're a vulnerable population that experiences multiple human rights violations. So this highlights that age-based discrimination is very much entrenched into the mainstream child welfare system in Canada. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. That was great. And how cool to see your video. I was actually at that art show opening, and somehow I am just now making the connection that was your work. That's fantastic. How cool to be brought back together again. So Margaret and Melanie, thank you both for doing such a great job of overviewing the issue. We've heard some comments as well from Simon in his opening remarks about the broad impacts of ageism on everything from health to work to other parts of our life. And I'd like to take a little bit of time to unpack some of those. Oh, and Melanie, while I'm thinking about it, can you unpack UNCRC for us just so that folks know what the acronym is and what it refers to?
Yeah, UNC is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Canada is one of the nations that has ratified it, meaning that they're committed to implementing it, and it basically provides rights for children who are under the age of 18, and it's everything from poverty reduction and elimination, housing, having your basic needs met, and things like that.
Perfect. Okay. And so from here on out, for participants, we're going to use UNCRC, and now you know what that acronym means. So I thought we'd start with a small topic, quality of life. But I'm thinking specifically about how much your quality of life is determined by your age. And I was thinking as you were both talking, here I am, a middle-aged person in between you both and thinking about these bookends. So Margaret, I'm thinking for you, what changes as you get older? What changes in your quality of life and your ability to access good quality of life?
Well, I think since our issue is talking about human rights and ageism, I think it's really important to mention that ageism has a huge impact on the quality of life of people because associated with a number of really negative attitudes and outcomes for older persons. Ageism can reduce longevity and it can have poor health outcomes. It can lead to poverty and financial insecurity. You get situations where you're facing workplace harassment based on your age or loss of work due to ageism, as we saw happened in the pandemic. There's a loss of self-esteem and confidence that can lead to the killer, which is social isolation, which really has incredible deep health impacts. There's no doubt that being patronized, ignored, and insulted have impacts on the person. And assuming an older adult is unable to make their own decisions, such as often happens in medical treatments, is one thing where you'll see a really horrible outcome. And it's really important that older people get to determine how they want to live and to direct their own medical care. Negative images in media and in broader society also have a really impact on the quality of life of older persons. You just have to check out a car section in any store and you will see really horrendous and insulting cards based on age, which we would never allow to happen to any other, race, religion, color, group, gender. So ageism is still socially acceptable, and we need to change that. because it actually impacts the quality of life of older persons. So it's very, very vital that we address it.
Yeah, no, it's such a good point. And I think I do some teaching. I teach about power structures. And one of the pieces of that I teach about is implicit bias. And I mean, you can do a ton of personal debiasing work, but as long as all the signals in the society around you keep reinforcing the negative bias, it's very difficult to move beyond that. So Melanie, I know you're coming to this with a very specific set of expertise around youth and care. So maybe I'll frame it for you a bit differently, that how is quality of life different for youth in care to access than it is for them when they become youth out of care? Does that make sense? Like what changes when they cross that line for them?
Well, as you could see in the video, there was like a snapshot of statistics of the outcomes of youth exiting care. They're not great. It illustrates that the status quo of the Canadian child welfare system is not conducive to quality of life for youth once they exit care. There's high rates of homelessness, poverty, undereducation, unemployment, mental health issues. The list goes on. And I think the reasons for that is because their whole time in the system, all the connections that they have are people who are paid to care for them. And once they reach the age of majority, that social safety net is completely ripped out from under them, and because the mandate ends and they can no longer have those connections and that like formal support system that they relied on throughout their time in care. I would say the outcomes of youth while they're still in care are also not great either. There's a lot of displacement that happens, not just like the initial placement into the system, but displacement during their time in the system. They move around a lot from placement to placement. They're oftentimes very far from their home of origin, moving around schools a lot. So there's a lot of trauma that comes along with that. And that trauma doesn't just magically stop because you've reached the age of majority. It continues on with you into your transition to adulthood and long into adulthood. So I think also one of the issues to point out is that any post-majority supports that are currently available across the country, they're not equitable. So it really depends on where you live, in which province or territory, on the degree of supports you're going to get after you reach 18 or 19. And oftentimes it's associated with strict eligibility criteria. So you actually have to be like a Crown Ward or a permanent placement or placement to majority to receive those types of post-majority programs. And it's been shown in BC, actually, which is deemed one of the provinces with the most comprehensive programs for youth exiting care, that about 2/3 of the cohort that ages out of care every year isn't accessing any form of post-majority supports. And that's because of the eligibility criteria that's associated with it. And youth fall through the cracks because of that.
I think I might follow up with both of you, starting Melanie and then to Margaret. I think both of you, as I hear you talk, for you, Melanie, and the youth that you're working with, it sounds like they have very little to no voice. And I have some experience myself with this. When they're youth on one side of an age line, the minute they cross over that line, they're expected to completely look after themselves. Whereas Margaret, the folks you're advocating for, as a middle-aged woman, I have a lot of voice in the world. I mean, I can think of some people who have more than me, but nonetheless, I have quite a bit. But as I get older, I've watched my mother lose her voice in society and healthcare and democratic rights, etc. So I'm interested in that interplay. Like, what is this line we cross where on one side we have a voice and on the other side we don't? And how much is that related to ageism?
I'm happy to start. It absolutely is ageism. That's ageism in its most, viral form, in the sense of not allowing people to speak and not hearing the voices, and that permeates all through the issues that I raised earlier. For instance, the fact that nothing's ever been done about long-term care, even though we've known for ages that it's a complete disaster, or that we haven't listened to older people who have been very clear that they want to age in their homes, and we haven't made policy changes that can actually accommodate that. So you can see it in different ways. In the healthcare system, it's the kind of situation where you hear healthcare workers, turn to the family and ask the questions about the health of the person that's sitting right in front of them, where you lose your voice about your most primary, feelings, your control over your body and your healthcare. So it's really and it's one of the reasons we really need to address this whole issue of ageism. We need to out it in a way that it has not been. And I think Melanie's examples are very clear of that. And I think the ones I've brought forward so far also show the need to really expose ageism and make sure that people understand that it's hurtful and that it steals human rights.
And has tangible impacts. It's a great segue, if you don't mind, for me to go into the housing issue. I feel like it's not really a dialogue in Canada in 2024 if we don't talk about housing in some way, shape, or form. And it plays in a very substantial way when it comes to ageism. So not everyone in Canada is in a housing crisis, but many people are. And age plays a big role as to whether you are. Would love to hear both your comments on that, about the role of age in the housing crisis. Melanie, maybe we'll start with you this time if you're good with that.
Sure. Youth exiting care are actually very overrepresented in the youth homelessness population. There was a national survey done by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness in, I believe, 2018 that found that homeless youth are nearly 200 times more likely to have been placed in care and had child welfare involvement. And youth in care also tend to begin their adulthood living below the poverty line because they don't have that safety net that most kids do in the general population. So they have a much higher reliance on social assistance at 40% than their peers at 2.5%. So that's a huge discrepancy when you look at poverty. And so housing instability goes hand in hand with that. And the statistics are getting worse, not better, because of the housing crisis that we've seen exponentially increase during the pandemic. I also did another photo voice study with youth exiting care who experienced homelessness in Halifax. The link to that project, it's called Finding Our Way Home. It'll be put in the chat for you to go take a look at. The youth expressed that they actually became homeless while they were still in care because of placement breakdown. So whether their foster home or group home, it just didn't work out and they ended up being homeless, or they were experiencing domestic violence, and that's how they ended up on the streets. They also expressed that shelters were not appropriate for them. They didn't feel safe there. There was a lot of violence there, a lot of overcrowding, and it wasn't focused on their needs. And another component that was shared by the youth is that they're not able to access the emergency supports that they need in the time of crisis before they experience homelessness because of bureaucratic red tape, because of age limits for applications. For example, in Nova Scotia, you have to be 19 to apply for a rent subsidy. And so that waiting period, they would become homeless because they couldn't be eligible to apply. So we really need a holistic approach to housing for youth in care. There's actually a promising program from Away Home Canada called Housing First for Youth that we're looking at. And really housing, it needs to be a human right. It can't be a commodity for the wealthy, period.
I love Angelique. He's just got the links going in. So that Finding Your Way Home report and the program is in the chat if you'd like to find out more about it. Margaret, let's talk about older adults and housing. I myself hosted a podcast last year for the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing, and it was pretty shattering hearing how many older women end up in housing precarity or homelessness just solely because they're older.
Yeah, well, older people are experiencing homelessness at a higher rate than any other cohort, according to Canada's National Shelter Study. So you've hit the nail on the head, Andrea, in terms of that. And of course, women live in greater poverty than men. We all know that for a number of reasons because of the prejudices they face through their life. It doesn't get better when you get older. And many older people who are homeless in Canada don't have access to the kinds of needs that they need in a shelter. Those shelters and temporary housings are just not designed or resourced for older persons. Moreover, there are many older people who are in precarious housing or unsheltered, like living outdoors or in cars or living temporarily with families and friends. And they're not even included in the statistics. So we don't even have a total clear-cut view on how many there are. And I suspect that is with groups facing homelessness. We also know that older people facing homelessness often had a history of injustice and trauma, and they require special approaches to meet their needs. And we really need to have different sections of society talking to each other, from long-term care, healthcare providers, workers who are on the street. And that really isn't happening in a comprehensive way. And we need to really think about how to do that, and to think about how we can support older persons in those positions and make their lives better and get them back into housing. And I don't think you can talk about housing and older persons without discussing the whole continuum of care. And by that, I mean home care, long-term care, and then access to hospitals. We discussed in my speech the state of long-term care. Really, part of the answer to long-term care is to better finance and increase access to home care, which, as I mentioned earlier, is what older persons want, which is to be able to stay at home as long as they can. And by the way, it's much cheaper. So we need to look at different ways of housing people, new and innovative housing, like naturally occurring retirement communities and intergenerational housing, which, we could look at issues that might support groups in Melanie's cohort as well.
Well, all of this feeds into a topic that's maybe a little spicy, although very topical, which is democratic enfranchisement. As I disclosed up front, I am from British Columbia, and some of you may have heard we are anxiously awaiting hour by hour the election results. I know Saskatchewan has an election today. Premier Ford maybe mentioned there might be an election in the offing not too long from now. And age and electoral politics actually also goes hands in hand. I mentioned I study about power, and this is part of why I went into that line of inquiry, is because you see the people who have power have a strong voice in the democratic system, and so the policies meet their needs, whereas those who don't have power get a smaller and smaller voice over time. So I'd love to unpack that a bit as it goes with age. So we often think about younger folks being absent from the electoral system, and I think that's an unfair characterization, but we can get into that. But Margaret, when we were prepping for this, we talked about the challenges that older folks have in terms of accessing electoral politics for sure, but just the whole spectrum of democratic enfranchisement, talking to a city council, getting involved in a public policy issue. Can you talk a bit more about some of the barriers that exist?
Sure. So first of all, I do want to acknowledge that older people do tend to vote, and that's shown statistically, so we know that. But that doesn't mean you ever get consulted on issues that actually impact your life. And there's some really key examples where the issues have come that change the lives of older persons, and they haven't been consulted on them. One really good example is when there was a proposed change to the eligibility for pensions from 65 to 67. And that change would have thrown 100,000 plus older women immediately into poverty. And no one looked at that until some of the anti-poverty groups started to examine it in some of the universities, and they figured out this was going to have a huge impact on women almost immediately. But there was no consultations. There wasn't consultations with older women. There wasn't consultations with aging organizations about how that was going to come forward. Another example, which is quite horrific, is the Ontario More Beds, Better Care Act, which was put into place without discussions with older persons or with advocates. That law basically is the one I mentioned quickly in my speech, which allows hospitals to determine where older people are going to live and push them out of hospitals into long-term care homes in areas they don't want to be, into homes they don't want to live in. And it's an incredibly powerful tool that really is a clear human rights violation. We're lucky that the Advocacy Centre for Elder Law and the Ontario Health Coalition are actually taking the Ontario government to court. And quite horrifically, last week, Premier Ford got up to defend that act and said, "Oh, the hospital administrators just love it. It's really great." Well, that's wonderful to hear from the people who are actually using the human rights of older persons. But quite frankly, I would have liked to have heard from older persons who've been pushed out into homes they don't want to be in. And there are at least 300 plus of those right now since the law has come into into act. So as the saying goes, nothing about us without us. We need to be consulted, as do all age groups, when there are violations that could happen to their rights and their voices are not heard. Older persons should be consulted on all policies that impact their lives, and particularly very basic things like the right to independence.
And Melanie, do you want to talk a bit about youth in care and democratic enfranchisement? I'm guessing, like housing, it can be a little hard to come by.
Yeah, I think just youth in general are often kind of treated in a paternalistic way and sometimes pathologized too, where they're infantilized in a way where they're saying, oh, you're too young to vote because you can't make rational decisions, but yet you're old enough to drive, to be enlisted in the army, and to be impacted by political decisions. So to me, it's kind of like a dual ageism happening there. And oftentimes, youth in care don't see themselves in politics because they're not a priority area in political platforms during elections. And young people are barely ever mentioned at all in general. So there needs to be a change in that. And I think in the video too, one of the youth co-researchers mentioned that youth in care are often not even at the table and included in decisions that will majorly impact the direction their life is taking. And this really needs to change whether they're under or over the age of majority. They should be involved in the decision making. They should be considered as experts of their own lives and really the ones that should be leading the solutions. And that includes, at the policy tables as well. I think youth in care specifically become disillusioned with politics and public systems and authority figures.
I hope we have a cliffhanger. Melanie has frozen. It's inevitable on every Zoom that we have. I'm just glad it's not me yet, at least. I think I might finish off some of that to say, it is I was not public about my own background when I first got into politics, but made a choice to be more public about it. Because I thought it was important for youth in care and people who'd been through some of the experiences I'd been through to be able to see themselves reflected in politics. Because if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I, as a result of that, had quite a number, I guess what I'd say, a surprisingly large number of elected officials quietly get in touch with me to let me know they'd had similar experiences in their youth. But weren't talking about it because of the stigma, right? So as long as, Melanie, I don't know how much of that you caught, but I was just filling in some of my own experience in elected office that it's so stigmatized, some of being a youth in care, having the experiences that street involved people have, that people don't talk about it. And as a result of it, people that are living those experiences don't see themselves reflected, and the cycle sort of continues. So I made a very active choice to decide to start talking about it. Which comes at a bit of a price, but I think the cost benefit the benefits have been much higher. That it's important for people to see that no matter what the worst day of their life look like, there's an opportunity for them to be in positions of leadership.
Absolutely. Apologies for, I don't know what happened to my internet, but I just toggled it on and off. Hopefully that fixed the issue. But yeah, I think not feeling seen and heard is a big barrier to democratic involvement for youth in care. But there's ways to have meaningful youth in care engagement. Like, for example, in New Brunswick, we had youth in care hearings at the provincial legislature, which was led by the New Brunswick Youth in Care Network. We had the first one in 2012, and there was another one a couple years ago. I was part of the first one as a network member, and we presented our stories to the Premier and the Minister, Child and Youth Advocate, a bunch of really important people, important decision makers. And it was really impactful, and we came forth with recommendations too. So not only are we, talking about the issues, but like we also have the solutions. And I think we need to be provided with the opportunity to share that based on our lived experience.
Perfect springboard, because the last thing I wanted to do before we get to audience questions, and indeed I've been looking at the audience questions, some of them come into this territory as well, is to talk about some of those solutions. We talked a lot about impacts, but it's an opportunity, I think, to frame up as we move into the audience questions where some of the promising practices are. So Margaret, maybe we'll start with you. What are some of the promising practices that you've seen?
Well, I think one of the things that was outlined in the World Health Organization's global report on ageism are the three broad interventions that we know from research actually help. And that first one is education programs. And that is all through the education system, but also with the general public with things like anti-ageism campaigns, where we can look at how ageism impacts different groups and look at the solutions to them. And actually, even making people aware of ageism, which is very much a hiddenism, would be a huge step forward, so that people understand it and recognize it when it happens. We need really clear changes to laws, programs, and policies. And I think the first place to start with respect to older persons is things like where you live, long-term care, those kinds of things. Very basic human rights need to be addressed in the first stages of this. Also, we need to look at intergenerational work and solidarity. And I think, I've learned a lot today just listening to Melanie in terms of the kinds of areas that youth are facing and the challenges they have. And I think there's really interesting intergenerational support and understanding that can come out of programming on that front. When I was working with the University of Ottawa, they sent older students in to long-term care and match them with persons with dementia. And it was fascinating because what came out of that is that the students that were there ostensibly to help the older persons with dementia actually got as much out of that as the people with dementia. So there was a real exchange and understanding that came out of that. I think programs like that are fundamental to eliminating ageism, and we need to think about how to do that in healthcare, social services, in workplaces and media. And there might have to be a very exacting program to address the kinds of ageism that happen in those places, in businesses, communities, and families, as well as self-ageism and understanding it and seeing it. As I mentioned, we need to look at the care system and review best practices around the world and best practices on how to address isms. If you look at Australia, they have far fewer deaths in long-term care than Canada. Why we haven't adopted those yet is a mystery to me. We also need to study countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, who have focused on care in the community and who spend a lot less money on care than we do and have lower institutionalizations and much better outcomes. So why aren't we doing what the evidence shows us? It's a bit of a mystery. We also need to make sure that pensions and all of the social safety net pieces are kept up so that with the cost of living, so that, whatever age who is facing challenges in terms of getting basic, housing and access to, food and whatnot, that it's keeping up to the cost of living. And I don't think we're seeing that right now. We just saw all over the news today that the food banks don't have enough supply. And, why on earth isn't our system, in a place where we don't have to send people to food banks? Why aren't we supporting people in a proper way? So there's my 2 cents worth.
That's great. So, if I were to summarize that, there's a good evidence base out there, and in fact, leading and best practices around the world that we can draw on. Absolutely. So, Melanie, you were just in front of a Senate committee talking about exactly this question. So what can you share with us here today about what some of the promising practices would be?
Yes, I presented to the Standing Committee on Human Rights last Monday. They launched a study on aging out of care, and they want to find out how the federal government can get involved. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Canada is actually one of the rare Western countries that doesn't have national standards or guarantees for supports for youth exiting care. And this is something that I've been working alongside other people with lived experience to try to rectify. We developed what we're calling the equitable standards for transitions to adulthood for youth in care. We released those in 2021. Myself and the National Council of Youth and Care Advocates, which is comprised of people with lived experience from across the country, youth and care networks, and a couple of key ally organizations like Away Home Canada and the Child Welfare League of Canada. And this was our way to provide really a step-by-step rights-based approach that's centered on lived expertise, research, and best practices to really guide how youth in care need to be supported as they transition to adulthood. We developed 8 transition to adulthood pillars I don't know if this slide is going to be shown or not, but I did share some slides regarding that. If not, we'll put a link in the chat to take you to more information about this project. But we developed 8 transition to adulthood pillars, which were based on the key developmental areas that youth and care need support in as they transition to adulthood. And this was based from our own kind of brainstorming sessions, what we know from the research, and then we also validated that with youth in and from care across the country. These pillars are not in order of importance. They're really holistic. They have to be dealt with holistically and not in silos. And I think that's one of the issues that we're having today is those areas are so siloed, and it needs to be complementary to each other. We also have standards associated with each pillar. I think that's the following slide. And it's basically a rights-based statement or standard that's centered on equity and justice for the youth and care community so that they can succeed and they can thrive as they're transitioning to adulthood instead of being caught in this cycle of survival mode and some not making it. Like there's a lot of youth that end up dying after they age out of care, whether it's by suicide or overdose. The rates of that are really high when you compare them to the general population. So the ultimate goal through this project for us is eventually we are living in a society where the term aging out just no longer exists for youth in care, that they transition to adulthood based on readiness and developmental capacity instead of an arbitrary age. So we're really meeting every individual young person where they're at and not trying to get them to fit in certain boxes created by the systems. And we presented this as a solution to the Standing Committee on October 21st. And we asked for the federal government to enact federal legislation that also supports the establishment of these standards nationwide.
That is great. I love this. And I think something we can share out after the,
yes.
Great. Okay, so we're going to move over to audience Q&A. There's quite a few questions already in the Q&A section. Angelique put the instructions in the chat again, but essentially you click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a computer, if you're on a tablet or a phone, that's probably somewhere on your screen. You click on it, type your question, then press enter, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Margaret, I think I will start with you. There's quite a few questions that have come in that are sort of like there's this need for an international, the convention that you spoke to, but they really kind of bring it down to the ground level. So in a workplace, in housing, wherever it is, how do we help older adults who are no longer welcome, forced to retire, or policies and legislation that don't exist to protect them practically in Canada today? What could someone do in the short term?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons I was advocating for an ageism campaign, because I don't think people really realize how toxic it is and how much it affects lives and livelihood, like you just used in the example of losing work. And that happens, more frequently than you think, in terms of there's an idea that at some time you're too old to work at whatever job you might have and that you're taking someone else's job. So those kinds of ideas, they're wrong, and we need to address them, and we need people to understand that. It's a little bit like in the 60s when women were asking to have equal access to work, and it was seen, that you were taking a man's job, that you have to mandatory retire at some age, arbitrarily chosen, it is wrong. And also it's wrong to be in a situation where you're pushed out. And that is where the ageism insidious nature really, really impacts older persons. So it's that idea that somehow it's not yours, you don't have a right to it. So we need to address those rights, and we need people to understand what ageism really is. And I often comment that the work we're doing on ageism is a little bit like being in the early days of the feminist movement, where really basic human rights for women had to be argued to make people understand that. We need to standardize this as well, and we need to make that happen now.
One, I think,
where part.
Yeah, it is. It's very much like you need I'm thinking there's a fantastic framework that I often use in my policy work called the Water Systems Change. And it has this top level that's the explicit level. So this is policies, laws, conventions, regulations. There's a middle level, which is sort of politics and systems. But then the foundational level is beliefs and worldviews. And I can say as a woman and also as the parent of a transgender child that laws are one thing, being able to practically enforce that at a meta level, or especially in the micro and the day-to-day, is where this concept of being more than a bystander comes in. And all the work that we hear about anti-bullying is sort of what we have to call to action and get bystanders engaged.
We do have really good examples, though, how conventions have really impacted the lives of recipients. For instance, we know that there was a third drop in child labor from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We know that there have been, big movement forward in terms of access for people with disabilities since the Disability Act. And we have examples with respect to women, like the Canadian Family Courts that came out of that. And those things can really change lives. So I think we have to think about those frameworks, especially in the early days of the movement, like we are right now with ageism.
Yeah, great points. Okay, so Melanie, I have so many questions for you that all sort of come down to one thing. I think Linda puts it very well. Given that we have research that shows that the prefrontal cortex does not fully mature until age 25, you get a bent on me here that I like the data-driven stuff. Can we not change provincial legislation to extend the age that you can stay in care? And I think there's just a lot of people that are like, this seems like just completely untenable. And so what does it take to get it on the agenda? I mean, I talked about all these provincial elections happening. How do we get it on the agenda of provincial legislatures?
Well, that's kind of what we've been doing through this work since the beginning of the pandemic. We really seized that kind of policy window that presented itself from being able to do things virtually. So being able to access key decision makers much quicker than before and from, across the country. So at the beginning of the pandemic, myself and the National Council, we advocated for moratoriums on aging out of care. So like pausing the aging out because nobody was making any announcements. No province or territory was, even though there was, Health Canada was making, CERB and all of that for the rest of the population. So we are actually successful in getting moratoriums or emergency measures established in a lot of the provinces and territories. So the work that we're currently doing now is a continuation of that to say like, okay, that's great, but those have expired. Now what? What do we do long term? And yeah, what we were doing before the pandemic wasn't working. It's not working for anybody. It's not working for the youth. It's not working for the systems. So we're starting to see some changes. Actually, some provinces have changed their legislation to extend care. In New Brunswick, they implemented a brand new act in January of this year called the Child and Youth Wellbeing Act, and it extends care up to age 25. PEI has also recently done that as well, where they extended care up to age 25 as well. So there seems to be some momentum building, and I think the provinces and territories do understand that 18, 19 is much too young to transition to adulthood fully, and that it truly needs to be a transition, just like young people in the general population get to experience. We shouldn't be expecting traumatized, vulnerable youth to overachieve and overperform what youth in the general population are expected. So I'm hoping that really it's just the beginning of, nationwide change when it comes to legislation. But really, the age extension is just a first step because really it shouldn't be based on age, like I mentioned. It needs to be based on readiness and a developmental capacity to fully transition to adulthood.
Awesome. Okay, this is great. Francis had a question about specific laws or programs. So it sounds like looking at New Brunswick and PEI is a good next step, and then looking at what you're asking for through the Senate committee document, the presentation that you shared is a good next one. I am thinking for both of you, because there's just so many questions about how do we act on this at a ground level. If somebody was in charge of booking speakers for a workplace or a club or something that they're doing to help spread the word, who and where would they go? Maybe we'll start with you, Melanie, and then Margaret, on your respective campaigns that you're working on.
I would say contact myself and the National Council so that we can talk about the equitable standards, because it's not just the responsibility of like ministries or governments, it's the responsibility of all the sectors that work with youth and infant care. So the community sector, the private sector, post-secondary, any really institution that works with young people in infant care should really want to adopt these standards so that they can do their best work with them and achieve better outcomes as well. So I would say that. On an individual level, I would say write to your MLA and MP about this to raise awareness about it and to show your support. We actually have a letter writing campaign that's on the National Council webpage. It's the same link tree that's in the chat. You can just go to the National Council's webpage, scroll down, and there'll be letter templates there for you to just sign and send to your local MLA or MP.
Perfect. I feel like I'm blowing our call to action section, but the calls to actions are the kind of things that you want to repeat as often as possible. So Margaret, over to you. Where would people go for sort of tangible resources?
Well, similar to Melanie, come to the International Longevity Centre Canada and join the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism, which is trying to do exactly what you just asked for, which is to pull together like-minded people to start to move forward. And we've done a couple of letter writing campaigns and have gone to a number of ministers with, different requests, including our call for a convention on the rights of older persons. We always get, nodding yes, and then nothing really happens after it. So I think we really have to push to make these electoral issues, and we have to make candidates understand that they need to be looking at this issue. And when they come to the door, ask them what they're doing for older persons, ask them what they're doing for youth. Are they addressing these kinds of issues that are really fundamental to our community? And I think that's, the most vital piece. You have to scream, and we need to shout, and we need to make this transition happen. And I'm really thrilled that the museum has done this actual event, because what this really does is start to shine a light on the fact that these are human rights abuses. And that is exactly how we need to see them. They aren't jokes and cards. They aren't kids you see on the street who you think ought to get a job. It's real people in situations that need to be addressed because their human rights are not being respected.
Awesome. Okay, so calls to action, we're going to come back to that, but I have a couple of other sort of specific questions. Margaret, there's a few here about specific things relating to older adults, so I'll start with one. It's from Zena, who says, Margaret, can you speak to the different types of housing that older adults need and that are lacking? Supportive housing, intergenerational, assisted living, naturally occurring residential communities.
Sure. So just to start with naturally occurring, we have a couple of them actually here in Ottawa. We're in buildings where there are a number of older persons that gather together, and they get services that come into their building to support them to stay in their home. So that's one a great example. Intergenerational, there's been some really interesting stuff done internationally in terms of with college students and university students, and possibly think about the youth, Melanie, that you're talking about, that are housed with older persons who have homes, but where they're empty nesters, and there's room now for others to move in, and that older person might need that support to keep their home, stay in their home, or they might need people to help them just keep the house going, shoveling snow or whatever it is to be able to stay in your home. So those kinds of intergenerational pieces are really interesting. And I think we need to look at them a lot more closely, as the housing crisis increases and as ways to look forward to that. There are, I'll tell you, older women like me, I talk all the time with my girlfriends or with, my husband about, would we ever want to, share a house with other people so that we can stay together? So there's lots of different ways in which you can look at housing. But we haven't thought about it systematically yet. And I think that, again, needs to be part of our policy thinking and in terms of influencing policy. we have a right to home and housing, and we need to think about what those are and how we can make sure that they continue to happen.
Great. Melanie, I have one for you from Kieran, who says, Melanie, what you have outlined so eloquently for youth in care also applies to youth who live with mental health conditions and psychosocial disability. The systems are currently not flexible enough to accommodate this cohort of youth seamlessly. Your reflections?
Yeah, this is something that comes up a lot when we have conversations in various sectors about this, because again, youth have to age out of the youth system into the adult system at the age of majority because it's structured this way, but it might not be developmentally appropriate for them, and it might actually cause further trauma. So this is definitely a framework that can inspire maybe better ways of transitioning young people with mental health challenges from the youth system to an adult system, to encourage it to be much more developmentally appropriate for them, as well as really meeting them where they're at. We also have an entire pillar that's dedicated to mental health and wellness that kind of goes into detail about what the key supports are. And
no, we've got a freeze again. It's okay. Melanie freezes better than anyone I know. Like, her face looks great. Mine always looks a little combo. Oh, we got you back. Awesome, Melanie. Sorry about
I don't
that.
know what's going on with my internet today. This is so strange. Out of all days, but okay, I'm back, I guess.
So where did we left off a bit around, you were sort of mid-sentence when you froze. So maybe if you can just repeat the last part of that, and then we'll move on to the next one.
Yeah, I was saying that the health and wellness pillar of the Equitable Standards looks at developmentally appropriate supports and services, as well as trauma-informed supports and services. And that entails not...
I don't think the internet wants her to answer this question.
No.
It's okay.
May I just add one more piece to the question that Zena brought up?
Yeah.
Which is back to just home care. Canada is really neglectful in regard to home care and quite stingy with hours and supports for home care. And I think that's back to kind of the law and policy piece and the human rights piece. I think that's one where we really need to dig in deep and look at ways to help people stay in home and look at innovative ways to make that happen.
There's a couple questions, Margaret, I wanted to raise with you. I'll put them in one question for you around caregivers. Okay. Why do the majority of caregiver training curricula not include information about ageism? And how do you think Canada can attract more caregivers for older adults?
Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. Okay, to begin with, why doesn't it include ageism? Because we're just starting to fight to get ageism into curricula with healthcare workers and care workers. So that is a really important question. It needs to be addressed. Some of the work the Canadian Coalition on Ageism is doing right now is looking at healthcare workers and looking at ways in which we can train them with regard to ageism. So I think that is a really important piece. And by the way, often in the case of older persons, the caregivers getting treated with ageism as well, because they may be, the spouse of or the partner of the person requiring care, and a whole bunch of their rights and their needs aren't necessarily addressed as well. So really key to be looking at that whole issue of caregivers, how they can be supported. And we need to look also at to turn that on its head and look at when those situations work really well. What are the elements when caregiving is a really positive experience for all concerned, both the carer and the caregiver? So there's a lot more research that needs to be done, and a lot more of looking at how ageism and that issue affects caregivers. With respect to attracting foreign workers, well, how about paying them properly? And we saw the situation in long-term care where women, usually racialized women who've come to the country, are forced to work at a number of different homes. It's one of the reasons why the pandemic spread so quickly through long-term care in Canada, because those people weren't paid properly and weren't given respect in terms of really basic employment laws. So we need to look at how that is happening in our country, and we need to respect the those workers in a way that we don't at the moment, in many cases, not all.
So maybe I'll extend that into one more, Margaret. There was a question about what kind of policies an organization like the Canadian Museum for Human Rights might have in place as an organization when it comes to ageism in the workplace. And I think I'll ask both of you that. Melanie, I feel like there's probably applications or ways to think about how youth and care might be included in policies as well. Margaret, do you want to start, and then I'll move over to Melanie?
Sure. With respect to what the museum could do, I think it would be great if they did an exhibition on ageism and focused in on some of these key areas. If that's ever a possibility, that would be something I think that would be really helpful, because it is a key point. And just as an aside, Canadian NGOs and on aging have been incredibly active internationally and nationally with respect to ageism, and have done some really good work at the United Nations. And when I think of the museum, and as we rise up through the museum and we see the impact of human rights law and legislations, I think it's something we need to think about in terms of a new and emerging ism like ageism is, even though it's been around forever. So I think that's one great way. And the second part of your question was around. You had two pieces there, I think.
I was throwing it to Melanie to see if there were ways that this might apply, but I think you've come up with one really great way it applies. An exhibition seems like a great idea. Melanie, are there other ways that you can see organizations taking action?
Yeah, I think like reading up on the equitable standards is a good first step, and committing to figuring out how you can implement it internally. We actually developed an evaluation model that accompanies the equitable standards, and we're piloting it right now across 12 pilot partners, including 3 government ministries. So we have New Brunswick, PI, and Northwest Territories for the ministries involved. We're going to be launching it next year on an online platform, and having a national call to action campaign to get more ministries on board, as well as community-based organizations, private organizations, and so on. So I would say stay tuned, and when the call to action comes, I would encourage you to respond to it.
Awesome. Okay, well, speaking of calls to action, we are getting towards the end of our time. I feel like, Melanie, you just served me the best plate every time that I can bounce right off of. We are getting to the end of our time, and I would love to give you both a couple minutes each to talk, to just restate a call to action. I will start with you, Melanie, and then we'll close out with Margaret.
I think I've mentioned quite a bit of those throughout my talk, because I believe that in order to see change, we have to move into action. The youth and care community has seen dozens, almost hundreds of reports come out in Canada alone since the late 80s, with recommendations upon recommendations on how to change aging out of care, with nothing really concrete happening. So I think it's time to move beyond talk to action. And the ways that can be done can be, like I mentioned earlier, writing to your MLA MP just as a concerned citizen, getting more involved with local youth and care networks. For example, there's one in Winnipeg called Voices. If you're local to Winnipeg, get involved with those. If you're running an organization and you work with youth in and from care, look at the equitable standards and how you can implement them at your organizational level. And if you're a key decision maker, like a politician or a minister or someone that works in the ministry, again, look at how you can implement those at the ministry level and make significant systemic change that meets youth in care where they're at.
Awesome. Margaret.
Okay, well, to quote the great Maya Angelou, you need to be angry, and you need to take that anger and write it, talk it, march it, and vote it. We should be furious about the rights violations we've seen at both ends of these age spectrums. And I think our governments really need to start looking at this, and they need to look at the studies that show the empirical data that this exists, that is hurting its citizens, and that it needs to be addressed. We should probably have a national campaign on ageism. Let's make sure there is nothing about us without us in that. Let's get our governments to support the work at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. It's a no-brainer. It's simple to do. It's ridiculous that a Canadian government, Western government, hasn't done this. I think I would like to reiterate to have individuals and organizations join the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism and support our fight for human rights. So I think it would be great if people, that are listening today join us and support us and start to make this issue, the disgraceful ism, out in the open and addressed, and make sure that a human rights-based approach to all of the issues that we've raised is undertaken by not just by our governments, but by society as well. It's a societal movement.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Melanie, you've been very generous with your time today and with your wisdom and with your trust in me to guide us through the conversation. For everyone who joined us, I would offer the same thanks and my own call to action. Rights only exist in societies that take on responsibilities, and taking these calls to action and turning them into reality is now all of our collective responsibility. It's quite, as you've heard, an emerging area, so we don't have crisp actions for you like we would in a more mature rights area, but I think it's even more important that we as individuals stand up and join with others to make what is, I think, taken sort of as just the way things are and somewhat invisible problems and make them visible. So I'm going to pass it to our partners at Equitas to provide the final summary and thank yous to close us out this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Andrea. My name is Juanita. I am a Human Rights Education Advisor at Equitas. Equitas is the International Center for Human Rights Education, and we are a Canadian nonprofit that is dedicated to advancing equality, social justice, and respect for human dignity in Canada and throughout the world through human rights education. We're very proud to be a partner of this dialogue today because it aligns closely with our commitment to building resilient and connected communities that value the dignity and contributions of all generations. So this event holds particular importance for us today. And we heard so many insightful conversations that highlighted the impact of ageism, but also some of the best practices and the many ways in which we can all come together and honor the people of all ages. Some of the things that I heard today and that I am taking in my heart with me are how ageism as having tangible, real impacts that go way beyond our perceptions. And as a violation of human rights, we talked about ageism today as a form of discrimination that deeply impacts various domains. Another thing that I heard today is the importance of consulting people of all ages in decisions that matter to them and that affect their lives. So for example, engaging with youth in care, about decisions that affect their life transitions, in particular their transition into adulthood, and also engaging with older people that are needing that need to be consulted in discussions around their health, their access to social services, and other resources. So something that really resonated with me today is how not feeling seen and heard needs to be actually recognized and talked about as a serious violation of human rights. We also heard from Melanie about the unique challenges faced by youth in care, in particular about the disparities in expectations that are placed upon them in comparison to their peers. And while many young people have the option to stay at home and receive ongoing support, youth in care are expected to be fully self-sufficient. So at Equitas, we work with young people across the country, and what Melanie shared resonates deeply with the experiences of many racialized youth in Canada, who also faced systemic barriers and heightened expectations to succeed, even though they have fewer support networks and resources. So as we conclude, I really hope that we can each carry forward new insights and a deeper commitment to really breaking down the barriers of ageism. And I do want to say a final word of thank you to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and their amazing team who helps to put together this event. Also to Zena and Simon for their amazing leadership and inspiration, and to our amazing moderator, Andrea, and speakers, Melanie and Margaret, for sharing your experience and knowledge with us all today. And I would like to end by mentioning the important calls to actions shared by our speakers. So Margaret reminded us of the importance and potential impact of a convention for the rights of older people and our need to work together to advocate every day with the Canadian government to support and lead the way in this important work. And also Melanie invited us to think of a holistic approach to legislation that takes into account the unique needs of youth in care. So they invited us to write a letter to our MP, to our MLA, and really keep this conversation going and moving forward. So in sum, what I'm taking today is that we each have a role to play in building more inclusive communities. So I do encourage everybody who joined today to continue the dialogue, to read the equitable standards, and to talk to your friends and family and just keep the conversation going. I thank you, all of you, for being part of this important dialogue today. And I really hope you have a wonderful week ahead and that you all keep the conversation going. Thank you very much for joining.